You want me to double check it? Why? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, wow. Mm. Mm-mm. Yeah. If you've got your Bibles, turn to Jonah chapter 2. And if I know you're in Jonah chapter 2, that you can see chapter 1. I told Chris this morning, and I've been, thinking about prayer messages. And I've been writing a little book, a prayer book. And so it's in the progress. But um, I've been thinking about a lot of the Old Testament prayers like Daniel, or just thinking along that line. That's where I've been doing. And Jonah has been kind of like in my notes. And but this afternoon I stumbled into something. I started reading, Jonah. I said, I'm just going to read chapter 1, then I'm going to read chapter 2, because chapter 2 of Jonah is really what? It's where it's the belly of the well. It's as if Jonah has gotten what he wanted. You think about all the things that's really saying. It's also a prayer. It's a prayer that he begins, a prayer of a repented heart, or a confession. But did you know that there was a prayer before Jonah 2, and it's a sailor's prayer. People that didn't even know God began to pray to God. And so the title is A Prayer Before the Miracle. The miracle actually took place not Jonah chapter 2. The first miracle took place in Jonah chapter 1. You know what that miracle was? The miracle was that, there was a storm that came up, right? And so Jonah's aboard a ship headed in the wrong direction, the wrong direction of his calling. And so he's leading this way, and he's headed that way, and then everything seems, in the world is God is saying, okay, I see where you're going. I'm going to cause you to turn around. And so you see that in the story. Now, you know the story of Jonah, but I'm not going to read everything. But the idea is that in verse 5 it says, the mariners were afraid, and every man cried out to his God. You see that little g, his God. And that gives you an indication that these people aren't what? They're not saved. So you got one saved man on the vessel at the bottom of it sleeping. Remind you of anything? I went directly to the New Testament thinking about Jesus on the boat asleep, And the rest of them, they were saved, but they were just, this one is a little g God, and it says, and he threw the cargo off the ship because the waves and the seas was so violent that they thought the next thing to do is really just lighten the load, So they're doing what sailors do in a storm. They're doing what they know to do. And so actually when you think about it, we do that in our own storms. We begin to lighten the load. We begin to throw things out. We begin to say we're not going to do that. We're not going to do this when things begin to have turmoil in your life, And so when you begin to think of how they're doing it, they were lightening the load, but it says that, but Jonah had gone down to the lowest part of the ship and laid down and was fast asleep. There seems to be something about a person who's fast asleep in the middle of a storm. Either you just don't care, or you don't have a conscience, or you just wore out. You're whooped. You just tuckered out. And so, but I don't think he was tuckered out. I think he just thought, you know what? I throw my hands, I wash my hands of this, I'm done. I'm going down. I don't care what happens, And he had that mentality. He had that attitude. And so the captain catches him down there in verse 6, catches him asleep and says, hey, arise up and call on your God. Now, that's a capital G. The book of Jonah goes from chapter 1 from a little g to the big G. And so now it's identifying what God we're talking about, and perhaps your God will consider us. So he says, so that we not perish. And so you begin to see what's going on. Their gods have not rescued them. Their gods, their methods haven't saved them. They're getting no results, and so they find him asleep. And then what do? Verse 8, they begin to interrogate him. They cast lots in verse 7, and so like, who are you? Where are you from? Who's your God? Blah, blah, blah. And so he begins to tell him. He says in verse 9, he says, hey, I'm a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, and who made the sea and the dry land. And so Jonah's response to their question is simply, hey, I'm just a simple person who believes in the God who created all things. Now think about it. The prayer before the miracle, because before the miracle happens here, and you'll see the miracle in just a second, because the miracle is important to notice, but the prayer before it is even more important, because before then the scene became, before the prayer before the miracle, that means there was prayer before the sea became calm. That was before the fear turned into worship. That's before the sacrifice and the vows. So there's things that are happening that are out of their control. They can't do it, and it is answered with a prayer. It is addressed or confronted with a prayer, and then the miracle takes place. Verse 14. And verse 14 of chapter 1 says, and therefore they cried out to the Lord and said, we pray, O God, O Lord, please do not let us perish for this man's life, and do not charge us with innocent blood. You, O Lord, have done as you pleased to do. And now this is where Jonah is basically saying to them, well, if you want the thing to stop, if you want the sea to calm, if you want your storm to be over, just toss me overboard. That's what Jonah's saying, but they didn't do it. They were reluctant in doing it because, why? Well, it seemed to have some kind of significance. See, all the lots that were cast pointed to Jonah. He's the reason that all of this is taking place. And if he's the reason that all of this is taking place, maybe his God is pursuing him and has caused all this problem. So what do? They do what? They stop and think, well, wait a minute. We just can't toss them overboard and get what we want and be happy and go along our way. We better talk to his God. We better pray, confess to his God. And so that's what happens. Their simple prayer, it says, let us not perish, let us not, be charged with innocent blood. What they're saying is, we place ourselves in your hands. They already were in God's hands, but they were acknowledging that. And so do what you pleased to do, And so prayer is in three movements here. The first one is fear. Let us not perish. The storm has brought them to the end of themselves, and they know now they cannot save themselves. That's a prayer that we realize that every person is confronted with sometime or some point in their life. That, we need to either accept the fact that we are, at the end of ourselves and we cannot save ourselves. And no matter what we do or accomplish or however long we live or whatever it is that we've done, will never save us. And so the sailors realized, and another thing is that the fear oftentimes is what brings about this kind of direct confrontation of knowing just how small we really are and how big God really is. And so you begin to realize that fear was the means of bringing them to understand this. Secondly, you see a sense of humility. Let us not, don't lay upon us. Don't count it against us. Don't charge us with what? The innocent blood. You see, to them, they were doing what? They were murdering Jonah. They were going to throw him overboard. I mean, there's nothing else you could do. He's going to die. And it's because at their hands that he will die. Even though Jonah is requesting them to just throw him into the sea, they knew that they came with, it came with a sense of a charge or a sense of a duty or a sense of, reckon. So when you think about it, humility, and they looked to who? They didn't look to the little guys. They were looking to his God. So they understood that his God, the God of the heavens and the seas, the God who created all things, he understands that, hey, if he can do this, then he's going to hold it against us. And they were asking that he not be. So it's a sense of humility that they've come. They've come with fear and humility. And the third thing is they surrender. This prayer is a prayer of surrender. For thou, O Lord, has done as you've pleased. You see in verse 14. So they understand that it's at his will and his bidding that things are taking place. It's the highest point of the prayer. In fact, they acknowledge God as the right to rule, his authority. No longer arguing with God, but they are now what? Submitting to him. They're acknowledging him, and rightly so. And so verse 16 kind of turns, and then the men fear the Lord exceedingly. So you see verse 16, it says, and then the men feared. So they picked them up, verse 15, throw them into the sea, and the sea did what? Ceased. Now you see the miracle. There was a prayer, a sailor's prayer. He comes to realize that his little g God isn't capable of rescuing, saving, redeeming them. And so they realize, they turn to this man's God and recognize that he is the God of gods. And they acknowledge him. They come before him. They surrender to him. And then they do what Jonah asked them to do. And then the men feared the Lord exceedingly. It's almost as if it says, there was a point where they were just going to see, is this really going to happen? Is this really going to be, is this really true? I thought to myself, there are moments in our faith that, you're not doubting, but you're just wondering, is my faith enough? And you read the New Testament and you see the stories that are taking place and the things and the miracles that are taking place, and it's because their faith was so strong. But yet they still, were at a place where they were almost as if they were believing it, but yet wanting to see it, And so these men were saying, okay, we've tossed him overboard. And it seems as if he goes directly into water. They can't see him no more. And the water just went from way up to just all of a sudden, zoom. And all they see now is all the cargo they've thrown off just slowly floating away. And they've recognized that everything that they've been struggling with for the last whatever minutes or moments or time has all ceased. And it says, and it was with exceedingly fear. Men feared the Lord exceedingly and offered sacrifice to the Lord and took vows. It's like they confessed, yeah, we're sinners in need of salvation. They recognize God's ability to do the things that no one else could do. This is a moment in their prayer life that we begin to realize, sometimes the storm produces moments like this in our life. There are storms in our life that cause us to do just that. And so it brought these sailors to what? To a reverent fear of God. It said that they offered sacrifices to the Lord and they took vows. It was serious. It wasn't just a moment like, okay, we'll forget about it in a couple of days. It's like it really stuck. And so when you think about it, it was the prayer before the miracle that accomplished the work of salvation. The prayer before the miracle that accomplished the work of salvation. We've been meeting on this night about prayer. And a lot of the names that we've been mentioning or the subjects that we've been talking about or just, the things about prayer that we've been persistent about, committed to, asking for miracles or asking for things in those quiet prayers or in those moments that we've gathered in prayer, we know that the work comes from our prayer. That's where the miracle is developed out of. And you begin to realize that prayer was before, and it was before, and prayer was before, and you see it there again. It was before the sea was calm. It was before they turned to worship, because that's what they were doing in verse 16. That's a moment of worship and sacrifice and a sense of confession and things. So you begin to realize that it all developed out of the hour of prayer. Often true prayer reaches its deepest point, not when we get what we want. I want to say this again. True prayer reaches its deepest point, not when we get what we want. So if I'm praying to the Lord about a specific thing, if the Lord were to answer that prayer and give me that specific thing, that's not the deepest point of the prayer. That's not what I should look to say, well, I'm going to pray again. That's not what I should say, well, my God heard me and answered and gave me what I wanted. The thought is that our life should be developing a prayer life that lines up with God's will. And if it be his will that he answer the prayer in our wishes and our desires, then so be it. But if he doesn't, then we still continue to pray. And so you begin to realize when we begin, the true prayer reaches the deepest point when we trust God with what he wants, not with what we want. Let me say that again, because I want to put that in the context that we've been reading. Now, everybody understands exactly what we've been saying so far. These are sailors. These are sinners. These are lost people that have come to know Jesus Christ. Don't you find it kind of ironic that he was sent to Nineveh to do a revival, but it started on a boat going in the wrong direction? God is something, isn't he? He has a humor about things. Your work is to bring revival, and since you won't go over there and get revival and and you're going to go then we're going to bring revival that way, and then we're going to bring revival that way. Sometimes it works that way. God is just so awesome, so amazing to do things that even in our defiance, God still works his will out for the good of his glory and for the good of salvation. And so you don't never know. And it always reminds me that there's two things that I can do. I can either be obedient to God or I can be disobedient. But neither one of them changes what God will do. Neither one of them will change what God will do. Because even in my disobedience, God will still act. God will still get the glory. God still will show up and show out. Even if I'm disobedient sometimes. And that's amazing sometimes to realize. Because a lot of people think, well, if God's only going to do what I think, I'm called to do and I'm in agreement with. No. God created you. He formed you. He said, I know how many hairs are on your head. I know you in the womb. He says, I've got purposes and plans. So that means, just because you don't agree with God doesn't mean God isn't going to work out that salvation plan. And so you realize that that context, the true prayer reaches the deepest point when we trust God. Now listen to me, with what He wants, not what we want. Now look here, the story in the context says the sailors were doing what? They were doing everything in their power to make it through the storm, to last the storm, to not get shipwrecked in the storm. So they lightened the load. They did everything. They prayed. Pray to your gods. Pray to your little gods. Pray to your gods. Make sure, do whatever it is that you normally do, that one of your gods will hear what's going on and rescue us, save us. And none of those things happened until they go down to the belly of the ship and they realize, hey, there's a guy down here who's not doing anything that the captain has told us to do. You get up and pray too, buddy. And so you realize really quick that, our prayer reaches the deepest point when what? When we trust God with what He wants. What did He want? They wanted what? They wanted the storm to stop. What did God want? They wanted the man that He called to go to Nineveh to go to Nineveh. He wanted them to turn around. And so that's what God wanted. But in the midst of all this, there was a sense of disobedience. But God was going to make that right. And so really when you think about when you trust God. So He was saying what? Simply, if you want the sea to stop, just throw me overboard. Trust God to do what He's going to do in my life to make your life in accordance to His will. And so there's a sense of God working in two different groups of lives here to accomplish revival, whether it be in Nineveh or on a ship. Chapter 1, the sailors sound more surrendered than Jonah did, didn't it? Jonah didn't seem like he was really cared about it in none of that. He didn't care if he lost his life. I think that was the intent that he was thinking, hey, if this ship's going down and they won't let me stay on the ship and go down with it, then throw me overboard because surely I can't swim. It's too far away from land, and so I won't make it either way. But the sailors seemed to be more interested in what Jonah's God was capable of doing. Jonah's running, but the sailors are doing what? They're yielding. They're yielding to the Lord. And so, in the middle of it all, they cry out to the Lord in verse 14. In the middle of it all, they cry out to the Lord in verse 14. They prayed when they reached the end of themselves. You see it there. They cried to their gods. We just talked about that. The application of that thought is many of our greatest prayers were born in situations that we could not fix. There is tons and tons of Christians that can confess or, testify to that. In fact, I think the majority of believers can testify to that, situations that we cannot fix, and God brings us to a place that it brings us to an end of our means, our abilities. And so, there's many things that you could just draw up. I mean, personal struggles, concerns, burdens, there's tons of things in our life that bring us to that point to recognize that God is who He is. The second is that we pray with humility. Remember I talked about they had a sense of humility. They didn't want to be, accused of innocent blood. They didn't want blood on their hands. I always go to that Shakespeare play. What was it? It's not Hamlet, is it? What, Macbeth? He's got the blood-stained hands, and even though her hands are clean, she sees the blood on her hands. The sense of what she has done haunts her. And so, what a remarkable statement when you think about it. Lay not upon us, don't hold it against us, the innocent blood. Their intention was to throw him overboard, and they knew that would be a life that was taken. So, they were not demanding. They were not accusing. They were not bargaining with God at this moment. But in a sense of humility, a sense of humbleness, they were asking, recognize that that we are standing before a holy God, and the life that we are about to take, don't count it against us. Even after Jonah told them to throw him overboard, there was a sense of saying, hey, you've got my permission to do it. You don't need God's permission. But yet they sought God for permission. What that really is saying is this. They recognize the authority of God, the reverence of God. And so even after Jonah told them to do it, they hesitated to do that. They didn't want to act carelessly. They wanted to do what was right in the sight of God. That's pretty amazing to see these sailors and where they've come, and then all of a sudden, recognizing that reverence for who God is, the fear that they had in this God. Prayer is not informing God. Prayer is what? It's not controlling God. Prayer is bowing before God. And that's what you get this sense. That's the picture that we draw from these men. They've got him in the clutches, in his grips, and they're all standing there, and I'm sure they're at the edge of the boat, and, there's a crowd, and I'm sure there's things are being mentioned, and I think there's, some are saying throw him over, some are saying wait. I could just see the picture, and Jonah's like, yeah, do this thing. Come on. You ain't got to hold me. I'll do it, but there's a sense of hesitation and reverence. They wanted to make sure what they were going to do was right. Sometimes our prayers become filled with instructions. This is where we find some type of application here. How many times do we pray, God do this, God do that, God fix this, and it seems as if it's more of an instructive prayer for God rather than a prayer that's saying, Lord, you hold everything in your hands, and so we hesitate to do this. Is this what you want? And you get this feeling that's where the sailors, that humble heart, that sense of humility is coming from. They prayed with surrender. I know we talked about these three things, but I want to kind of just finish up with these three words. They acknowledged God's sovereignty. You see, they prayed with a sense of surrender. When you confess, when you surrender yourself, for thou art the Lord, for thou art the Lord. They acknowledge him. They surrender to who he is. You get the whole picture of them being bowed down, knelt down. That kind of sovereignty. The storm belongs to God. The sea belongs to God. Jonah belongs to God. You see where they are in this boat, in this situation. Their lives belong to God. You see, they wasn't outside of God's will, were they? What God was doing was just saying, hey, the sea, the storm, the heavens, the earth, Jonah are all mine. And so that would honestly bring us to a place that says, well, if everything else is theirs, then where do I stand? I'm not outside of God's ability or his power or his authority or his sovereignty. And so their lives belong to God. They do not fully understand what God is doing, but this is the truth. But they trust that he knows what he is doing. I think there's a moment right there where every person comes to recognize that maybe they don't understand what God is doing, but they begin to trust that God knows what he is doing. And that's a moment of surrendering. When you've said to yourself, I no longer you know, and my own authority, my own power, my own, you know, I see you as something that is greater than myself. And in that itself draws us to a place of surrender. Maybe you haven't heard it that way. Maybe that's new to you. Maybe that's something that you haven't thought on in a long time. But honestly, I think every believer that is walking this earth today in some way or somehow is fashioned to that, is connected to that thought. No longer knowing or maybe understanding who God is sometimes in their life, but definitely trusting God knows what he's doing. And so it's, one commentary was saying, it's not a resignation. Some people would say, well, I'm not capable of doing the job, so I resign. That's not what this is. They're not just resigning from a position that they hold or something that they wasn't able to accomplish. They're not resigning. That's a scapegoat. That's the way out without recognizing who God is and saying, I trust you. This is surrender. And the greatest arrives here. Jesus says this. He says, not my will, but thy will be done. True prayer is not getting God aligned with our will. True prayer is bringing our will into what? Into alignment with who he is. And so as we pray tonight, I think that's one of the things that we need to make sure that we run across our thoughts. And are we praying for God to do what we desire him to do? Or are we asking him asking ourselves to do what? To bring what we have into or in alignment with what God's will is. And so, you know what God did? He answered with peace. So they took up Jonah, cast him in there, verse 15, and the sea ceased from her raging. The storm stopped. It became calm. Before the sea goes calm in your life, maybe God's calling you to surrender first. This is a prayer that seems to be about salvation more than about a prayer on a Wednesday or Sunday night meeting. But I want you to realize that how important or how powerful your prayers are. We could pray today for any one of these people that we've been praying for. Here are churches. Here are members of our church, spiritual needs, physical needs, general purposes. And if we are bringing these prayers before God, God knows, how to accomplish what it is that we are praying for. This morning we said the field does what it grows. The field grows the harvest. A time of harvesting, what is that? That's a time of gleaning and taking and celebrating, and a time of, and you begin to realize that there are spiritual things in our life, that there are times of spiritual fields that we need to grow. There are times for spiritual gathering, harvesting that we need to recognize. And there's also times that there are moments when, what was the third this morning? When we realize we need to be reminded of what God has done. Verse 16 says, and then the men, feared the Lord exceedingly, offered the sacrifice unto the Lord and made vows. What began in fear ended with worship. What began as a storm ended as a sense of worship. When you reach the end of yourself, you cry out to the Lord, you come humbled, you trust his sovereignty, to surrender yourself into his will, because sometimes the prayer before the miracle is simply, Lord, let your will be done. And so we place ourselves in his hands. This morning or this afternoon, we're going to mention some names here really quick. And acknowledge, our desires to see what God will do. Maybe some of these things here, spiritual needs, are storms going on in people's lives. And before they actually recognize the miracle, maybe there needs to be a prayer. Same with the physical needs and the general request. I'm going to do these. Chris, you can come up if you want. I'm going to read these few names right here. And these churches, the Moriah Association for this month is asking that we be in prayer, intermission for, I don't know why I said prayer with no intermission. Prayer for these unceasing prayers, what I was meant to say. And here's the specific churches that are on this week's list for week 3, it says, here's the pastors: Covenant, Pastor Bobby Struther, Ebenezer, Pastor Ronnie Boone, Elgin, Pastor Rusty McAllister, Flat Creek, Pastor Bart Miles, Flint Ridge, Pastor Zach Bird, Fort Hill, Pastor Adam Furr, Friendship, Pastor Donnie Birchfield, Glenwood Heights, Pastor Daniel Porter, Hales Gold Mine, Pastor Edgar Horton, Heath Springs, Pastor Frankie Melton, and High Point, Pastor Logan Thomas. Those are 8 or 9 churches and pastors that I'm not really familiar with all of them. I know some of them, and I don't know them personally enough to say, hey, I know what their struggle is or what, but I'm just praying. I don't specifically pray for a miracle. I just simply pray that God knows how to handle and answer these. There are VBS participants. There's probably 25, 30 names on here. And what these were 2026 participants. These were people that came during VBS, heard the gospel, was encouraged. Your faith began to grow, plant seeds. God's watering those fields. We don't know what the harvest is going to be, but we do what? We're praying that through that time that God's will be done in their life. We may never see it, experience it. They may be back next VBS and just begin to see how, and you can see the growth that's in their faith, in their walk. These are the names that are mentioned there. These names, all this is also on the board in the hallway as well. For our church, many of the names that we mention every Sunday night are normally read out, but we're not going to do that tonight. The spiritual needs, I'm going to read some of these, and physical needs and general request. School children, that's for the spiritual needs. Our schools need, there's a need for God in the schools. There's a need for prayer. There's a need for God to plant faithful believers in the school system. And so you see Angie Shirley, college kids, teachers, Johnson family, Steve Gardner family, Langley family, Taylor family, Kathy family, the Gent family. None of these names that I've mentioned here, I don't know. I don't know any of them really, but I know the God who does. Gents live right up the road from me. I don't know if it's the same family or not. The Coker family, the Coffin family, the Hayes family. God has really worked in Hayes' family, hasn't he? I mean, there are some things that only God could do there. You just see the hand of God in those things. Paul Kennington, Josh Honeycutt, leaders of our country, lost souls, These are bigger things than individual people that we may can see or experience a miracle taking place. America and Israel. These have been on here as far as long as I know. And so repeatedly mentioning those things, God knows those things. Physical needs, the Kay Robinson, Kirkley family, Johnson family, Pawpaw Steve. Who's Pawpaw Steve? I don't know. He seems like a great grandpa. Pawpaw Steve. Deborah Quay, Judy Robinson, Betty Adams, There's so many down through here. Teresa Hunt, Kylie Wiles. That's one of them attends on us. Um, Don Sinclair. There's somebody hits home. You know, the Cooper's Burgers on here. Um, Ann Barfield's on here. Here's names that we know. Charlie Brown. I wonder if that's not my uncle. I read that name. I wonder when he was visiting. Oh, okay, he is. Yeah, he is. But maybe there's another Charlie Brown. Okay, all right. I just wondered. I said they visited a while back. I was wondering if he just filled out something, put it in the, and he's got his name on the prayer card. I said, oh, that's Charlie Brown. I know some of the struggles that he goes through, and so didn't know. Gene and Jimmy Todd. Um, you know. These are things that we're just bringing before God. He sees them, and I think we just faithfully we read them out week to week, just because we know the one who's able to answer the prayer. That's all I've got.